Good afternoon. It's Tuesday. I nearly got that wrong. It's Tuesday, the 29th of March, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Well, of course, it's been that long weekend, completely confused me over the days, but as promised, we are back online. Weather reports, well, we've got mixed bag. It's very dull and cold in Plymouth. Apparently the hail has just stopped in Holland. It's sunny in London, but very cold, the same in Norfolk, so changeable across the country. Hail Holland, apparently.
Started off nice here, but it's not a bit poor, really.
A bit poor. Okay, well, let's have a look at what's happening. We'll start off with Syria.
Yeah, things heating up on Twitter because, of course, the Russian embassy and also the two Foreign Office Twitter accounts, which is UK Against Daesh and Foreign Office, well, they've been trading insults, I suppose you might say, over the last several months. And this is the latest one. Liberation of Palmyra, a major victory over ISIS. Wonder why UK Against Daesh and Foreign Office keep silent about it. And indeed they did. Most of the media were blowing up the damage that was done and understating the Russian and Syrian efforts to recover Palmyra. But The Guardian, relatively balanced in their coverage of it. They're saying that antiques experts were watching nervously as the government troops moved into Palmyra, but that the damage they were surprised to see wasn't as bad as they initially thought. Of course, Palmyra fell to ISIS in May 2015. And if you remember, we saw those satellite images which seemed to show that they were able to clear the Temple of Bel in one night. So they seem to be pretty efficient for a ragtag band of terrorists as they're presented.
Indeed.
Yeah. But in the meantime, another Russian commander has put his head above the parapet. He has been previously unknown. This is Alexander Dvornikov, who is a colonel general, apparently. That might be a poor translation, I'm not sure. So he has given an interview to one of the Russian newspapers, and he was talking about the success of the Syrian campaign. And he was saying, I will not hide the fact that in Syria, there are divisions of our special forces. They carry out additional exploration projects for the Russian airstrikes, engage in guiding aircraft against targets in remote areas and undertake other specialist tasks. But he also made the point that, of course, in Syria, contrary to the Western media's presentation that it's a civil war, that similar tasks are undertaken by United States Special Forces and those of other coalition countries. And of course, Russia trying to keep the focus on ISIS and al-Nusra Front. There was this interview, I think this was on Friday in Deutsche Welle, and this is with another Russian deputy defense minister who was asked, Russia places great importance on military cooperation with people that they're working with. Who else are they working with? And he said, well, we're working first and foremost with our allies. That includes members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and that is the members of the CIS, the Russian states. And what isn't yet working is cooperation with countries of Western Europe. And he was asked why not. And he said the main problem standing in the way of cooperation with the nations of Western Europe is a lack of trust. In my diplomatic career, I've negotiated and worked with Western European countries and with the United States for more than 30 years. Over that time, I've often had the feeling that I was only useful to them when I shared their opinion. As soon as I voiced my own opinion and said that I saw things differently than they did, I was immediately seen as being conservative and undemocratic. Is it undemocratic to have a view which is different to that of the United States and Britain, Brian?
Yes.
So it seems.
According to David Cameron's Britain in 2016.
So the big question, if you read the rest of that interview and the other comments that from some of the Russians over the last few days, the big question is, what is the Western policy with regard to ISIS or Daesh or whatever they're called these days? Well, of course, ISIS not just in Syria, they're in Iraq as well, and the UK is now training female soldiers to take the fight to Daesh. Now, the reason that they're training females, they say, is because Daesh, as terrorists, believe if they're killed by a woman, that they won't go to heaven. So this is a psychological thing, they say. But you would have a slightly different view about women on the battlefield, I think.
Well, it's very simple in that if you look at what's happened in UK, there's been a push to bring women onto the front line, and in general that has failed in every country that's done it. This may be a difficult issue for some ladies watching, but if you do the analysis on it, that every time women are brought to the fore in the military, it actually causes problems. I think that what's going on here is those problems are now being exported into other countries. This is a very devious British operation.
But what do you mean by causing problems?
Well, all sorts of things come. All male units versus all female units, which the army tried as an experiment several years ago. The all male units outperformed, but nobody wanted to talk about it. And then, of course, the moment the women are introduced into the system, and I'll say not necessarily any fault of the ladies themselves, but what then happens is a breakdown in the structure, because the relationships start. And then it is officers with female junior ranks is the usual way. Male officers with female junior ranks. The MOD at the moment doesn't want to talk about any of these problems, but they're problems which are growing in intent, particularly in the Royal Navy, where, of course, you've got people in confined spaces for long periods of time. So just to be clear on this is manipulation of both sexes in order to create a particular status, which is breakdown of Britain's armed forces, and exactly the same technique has been used with the American military. Some countries that have tried female units separated from the male units, but ultimately they've abandoned that.
So in the case where you're pushing forward women to fight ISIS, in fact, you're potentially reducing the effectiveness of that fight?
I would say so, but also what they're actually doing is pushing British values. These new British values are now being pushed into other countries. This is exactly what BBC Media Action is about, is exporting the new British values into overseas countries. So whatever they're doing here, Mike, I would not trust what is being done by the British government.
Well, Michael Fallon had this to say: the Iraqis are rightly leading the fight for the security of their own country. These brave female fighters will help ensure that Daesh are kicked out of Iraq for good, and we must keep supporting them. Well, also, Michael Fallon announced, by the way, that the UK is going to be creating new defence attaché posts in Finland, Senegal, Qatar, Afghanistan, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia. So many of those countries that they're creating new defence attaché posts for are bordering Russia. And Fallon said these posts will increase Britain's global defence reach, backed by a defence budget that next week will increase for the first time in 6 years. They will help us build stronger relationships with our allies and deter threats against us. So I asked you this earlier, I'm going to ask again, what is the role of a defence attaché?
Well, personally, I would say there are two parts to it. It's being able to explain, in the proper sense of the word, what Britain's defence policy is overseas, and the second part of it will be to promote the arms industry. So you could say the minimum this is to help sell arms, but of course, what is Britain's global reach? Because the Cameron government are destroying Britain's military capability by the day. We do not have a global reach. The global reach is provided by the Americans, and of course it's the Americans that always take the brunt of the casualties. So Britain helps ramp up the wars. It's then America that takes the casualties. And interestingly, over the last few days, Mr. Trump has been complaining about the weight taken by America within NATO, which I'll come on to in a minute. Selling arms, I would say, Mike.
Right. Well, Russia wants to cooperate with the West and to attempt to defeat ISIS. Tony Blair thinks that we must be ready to deploy ground troops against ISIS.
What troops would he be thinking of, Mike? This is where we are talking utter nonsense, because we're now at the stage where.
Well, but he says West must, not Britain. West.
America.
So we or the EU military, yes, indeed, a combination of both. He said we must build military capability able to confront and defeat the terrorists wherever they hold territory and so on. But of course, Russia has made the offer. The West won't take it up. I'm just going to remind everybody what everybody thinks and what New Eastern Outlook has been asking this weekend. Will Tony Blair ever be brought to justice?
Well, I hope so, Mike. I think people have got to keep pushing. It doesn't matter whether it takes 30 years, as long as the man appears in a court of law. And what a wonderful day that will be. Well, let's bring us on to Mr. Trump, and Real Clear Politics here has got an embedded video where you can actually hear Trump talking about NATO, but he says very clearly that NATO is obsolete and expensive, and it doesn't have the right countries in it for terrorism. Now, I'm not sure what he means by that part of it, the right countries. But what he says is that we should readjust NATO to tackle terrorism. Terrorism's out of control. And this ties in very nicely with the fact that we now know that the European Union is going flat out for a single military structure. They're talking about an EU treasury, alongside it EU armed forces. And of course, it's always been the pull that we've got to stay in NATO that stopped the progression for the EU army. And here we are with the next step, which is going to be, let's start to tinker with the organisation of NATO, which will give the European Union exactly what it needs in order to start pushing forward the European military. And as we've said over the last few weeks, of course, that the cuts in Britain's armed forces have been part of an agreed tactic to reduce Britain's armed forces to a more manageable size, so that they can be brought in alongside smaller European armed forces, and there's a balance maintained. So I think, Mike, this is very significant. I think that Trump knows full well the next step is to start to pull back on NATO, to start to unpick the NATO alliance. And what are you going to replace it with? You're going to replace it with the creation of the EU superstate army, basically. Well, let's follow that up with this report. It's really the headline from Free Nations, but I encourage you to go and have a look at this article. It's saying that the EU is a security catastrophe, and the key point here being made by a number of people, including the former head of MI6, is that because there is no security now throughout the EU, open border policy means that you cannot possibly protect your nation against a terrorist threat. So there it is, it's a security catastrophe, but of course created by the EU itself. And then we have people like Sir Peter Sutherland, who has been following UN policy to say that we've got to increase the migration of people in order to break down national identity. So it seems that with one hand they're creating the problem of movement of people, free access for terrorists, inverted commas, and then the open border policy finishes the treatment.
Just before you move on, Alex, in the chat box there, interesting little comment. I see the EU army instead of NATO, with the US refocusing on China.
Well, I think that would make sense. This is trilateral policy that we see coming in. And of course, the whole NATO idea conflicted with that. So if you get NATO out the picture, then you can form your military into the trilateral basis. So you're going to have the Americas, you're going to have Europe, and then you're going to have Japan and China. There's a step to go at the moment, but that's where I think it's heading. And of course, the one thing that Europe is worried about is those who've legitimately got guns. Now, this was sent through to us. We're still having a look at some of this material, but it's extremely interesting. This is essentially a protest argument, and it's saying, EU, we have a problem, but you hit the wrong target. And the targets are, of course, that anybody but terrorists or criminals with unlicensed firearms, well, nothing's happening with them. The movement of unlawful, unlicensed firearms in Europe is an epidemic. Meanwhile, the EU is going for anybody who legitimately will have a firearm: hunters, collectors, museums, sport shooters. So this is the key bit of the message that all of the EU material is saying that thousands, tens of thousands of illegal guns are now being moved around Europe, principally coming out of the crisis areas. But the EU isn't really interested in those guns. What it wants to do is get them off decent, law-abiding citizens. Why would that be, Mike?
Can't imagine.
Do you think it's because the EU is increasingly worried about decent people standing up for themselves against corrupt criminal governments? So that must bring in the children, really. And of course, whilst the EU is doing nothing to stop terrorism, in fact, it's fomenting it, what have we been doing? Well, we've been targeting very young children with the PREVENT strategy, which in some cases has had very young children reduced to tears as they have been interrogated by the police and school staff as to whether they come from a sort of hostile family. But this is very interesting because the Mail is reporting that teachers have now got going through the union, the NUT, and they want to scrap the PREVENT strategy in schools because they say it's not safeguarding the children and it's making the children too scared to speak out. Now, what we were interested in is in the article itself, a spokesman for the Department for Education said it's highly disappointing to see the NUT taking this attitude towards the PREVENT duty, which is held up across Europe as being one of the best programs for identifying young people who could be at risk of radicalisation and extremism. Well, we gave the Department for Education a call and we asked them to provide the evidence to support this across Europe claim, and no reply, Mike.
Hardly surprising.
No, so you just make a claim that PREVENT is the best strategy across Europe. Absolutely no truth in it. It's just created out of fantasy land. So what else is coming? Well, we can often look to America to see what's going to come in next. And this is the New Yorker, and it's asking a really important question. Why are educators learning how to interrogate their students? Do have a look at this article. It's around a lady called Jessica Schneider who was handed a flyer. And what the flyer was talking about in Illinois was using the Reid technique literally to interrogate students. And it's being pointed out in the article that this is the same technique used by police officers, private security personnel, insurance fraud investigators, and other people for whom getting at the truth is part of the job. So children now, Mike, absolutely under the spotlight. You're a potential terrorist or a criminal, and they're going to use serious techniques to get at those children. This is already coming in UK, and of course north of the border we've got the named person scheme. This is the second part to it, which is the sexualisation of children. It's going on a pace both in US and UK, but a very, very interesting video sent through to me. There's two versions of it. One is a short 10-minute clip, and the other one is much longer, I think about 40 minutes. And what it's basically saying is that children are being sexualized. This is just part of a document that children are getting in American schools. It's basically asking them about relationships. But of course, what's been pointed out here is that you're encouraging the children to get into every area possible, including anal sex. And what's it really doing? Well, it's breaking down morality and true values. So the Americans here in Illinois beginning to warn about this, but of course we're seeing the same thing happen in UK. And probably that leads in very nicely to that wonderful political charity, Common Purpose, that has been getting into schools for years in order to reframe children's values.
Well, it's been interesting watching the various attacks on the BRICS infrastructure and the Asian nations in the last few weeks. Brazil, there's a colour revolution going on there at the moment, but that is an attack on BRICS. So it's hardly surprising then that Common Purpose is in fact pushing absolutely pushing hard into the Asian countries, the ASEAN countries here in particular. This is the Leaders Program for that area. It's an annual 2-part leadership development program, they say, which seeks to bring together 70 senior leaders from 10 ASEAN countries. Of course, they will then be used to push this type of thinking out into those countries and particularly among policymakers in those countries.
And young policymakers.
Especially, well, we already know that they've got separate campaigns running in universities in those countries. And the other area that they've launched a program for is Africa. So, sorry, country. It's a bit more than a country, isn't it? So we've got Africa under being targeted as well. These are groups of countries that are the regions, whatever you want to call them, that are being targeted by this organisation. See the same type of mind-bending techniques used there as have been used here.
So it's this is a Trojan horse operating here, Mike. You get in, you target certain levels of people, and then you use them to lever the whole structure over. It's an incredibly underhand. It's a subversive technique, and it's so obvious what this organisation is doing, backed by vast funds from international banks, and of course the British government and European Union itself.
Well, one of the areas and one of the techniques that they have used over the years, of course, has been the issue of multiculturalism and diversity in particular. And so that brings us into the issue of refugees. And apparently the UK is failing to take its fair share of Syrian refugees, and this is according to Oxfam. UK and other wealthy nations have resettled less than 2%. And of course, this, in a sense, is a bit of a messing with people's minds, because on one hand, we're being told we're not taking enough Syrian refugees. On the other hand, we're being told that recent so-called terrorist attacks in Europe have been caused by people that have been brought in, caused by the Syrian crisis. So which are we to believe? Are we to really not believe either of them or both? It's really hard to tell. And of course, you mentioned Peter Sutherland a moment ago. The other person who's absolutely pushing for this is George Soros. And here he's saying that he absolutely is admitting, Breitbart reporting, to being involved in the migrant crisis. They discuss Soros and how much money he's spent and so on. And of course, Soros has now written a response to Mr. Orban last week, who basically accused NGOs, mostly Soros-related NGOs, of making a living from the immigration crisis. Soros has another reason other than a living, because he doesn't actually need to make a living personally. So his money is being used for these NGOs because there's a political agenda at work with the migrant crisis. And I'm kind of subverting this article, really, because the point here that I want to make, this article is saying, could the language barrier actually fall within the next 10 years? And although this is talking about technology and algorithmic translation systems, really the first line of this says it all. Wouldn't it be wonderful to travel to a foreign country without having to worry about the nuisance of communicating in a different language? And when you look at the common purpose agenda, when you look at the refugee agenda, what we see is a breakdown of national identity, of national sovereignty, of languages. And what we actually lose when we break down national identity and sovereignty and languages is diversity, diversification. And we actually make humanity weaker by trying to merge people together in a way that they're not supposed to be merged together. If we want to celebrate other nations and other cultures, then we do that by supporting those nations and cultures. We don't support it by mashing everybody together and destroying those cultures and turning things into a mush.
It's the lie again, Mike, isn't it? The lie from somebody like Common Purpose is that we celebrate diversity, but actually celebrating diversity is the breakdown, as you say. Absolutely. And what's it designed to do? It's to weaken people, it's not to strengthen them. I mean, just imagine going to every country in the world and all you can eat is a McDonald's burger.
We're not far from it, are we?
That is where we're heading. And Tower of Babel there, of course, and the European Central Building modelled on that very structure, presumably for a reason. But somebody else has been pointing out Soros, and we've got this very interesting organisation, which is Media Matters, and they're researching communications, and they're focusing in on Soros's efforts to control mainstream media. Now, they're picking up principally here on America, but nevertheless, this is a very interesting development that people are now focusing on Soros and saying, what is this man doing? Why is he being allowed to control mainstream media in such a way? I don't know a lot about this organisation, so I'd encourage our viewers and listeners to research themselves. My only comment is that they're saying in that first sentence that George Soros has spent an astounding $52 million building the Soros web, a vast array of corporations and associations. 52 million is sort of this loose change that Soros leaves on his bedside cabinet because he admits himself in Open Society to spending a minimum of $1.9 billion in order to set these networks up. So the article seems to be heading in the right direction. Who is this man? Why is he allowed to do what he's doing? And but the sums of money seem to me to be very small.
Indeed.
So if you're going to deal with the media, what do you need to do?
Well, if the only reliable source of information is the media, of course you've got to destroy libraries, and that's exactly what's happening. And we've been talking about this for a long time, but this is the latest report covered by the BBC here. They've done some freedom of information requests, and they've discovered that 343 libraries closed last year. Out of those, 132 were mobile, 207 based in buildings. We're seeing this in Plymouth. We're seeing it everywhere. Plymouth are selling books off left, right and centre almost every week. It seems like they've got a book sale in Plymouth Library. Another 111 library closures planned this year. And of course, if all that you're left with is the World Wide Web, which can be changed on a whim, and David Cameron's Conservative Party, of course, as we pointed out before, have already changed their own history on their website, then we get to a situation very close to that envisaged by George Orwell, where the news can be changed retrospectively.
And in the chat room, as we are speaking, people are talking about this, that you put a document up for translation, it's sucked onto the cloud. But of course, the moment it's electronic, things can be changed overnight, whereas books can't. But at least Plymouth's selling the books. They're not actually burning them in the streets, Mike.
No, well, that's true. But of course, once a book goes into an individual's hands, it can't be shared.
That's true.
So, right, next, what have we got? Economy. This is Sagoma. This is an organisation I'd never heard of until today. They call themselves a special interest group of 45 urban authorities in the Northern Midlands and South Coast regions of England. We are the collective voice across these regions and embody the opportunities and potential of the communities who live there. The Sagoma Group of local authorities has a joint population of around 13 million people, making it one of the largest special interest groups within the Local Government Association and accountable for about 25% of local government spending in England. And they say that their aims are to represent the interests of their members within the Local Government Association, channel the views of our members to government, the LGA, government departments and other appropriate bodies, and provide a forum for discussion at the highest political level. Well, they have produced a report which is really slagging off the government's whole notion of the Northern Powerhouse. They're calling it a PR campaign, which of course we know that it is. And they're making the point that in fact, if you look at the figures, George Osborne has removed £3.5 billion from the so-called Northern Powerhouse rather than giving them very much. And they're making the point that the only real investment that's happened in the north is road upgrades, and of course we're talking about smart motorways here. So this is about future road charging, not about producing better infrastructure for the country. Now on the map on the right-hand side there, you can see that the Liverpool, Manchester areas are in deep red. Further north, more deep red areas, and these are the areas that have had most money removed. Now, on one hand, you say that they're highlighting the issue that Osborne is basically lying when he says that he's pumping money into the north. But of course, the reason that they have done this is because they are really pushing for this devolution plan, so their complaint is really they're really asking the question: how do we proceed with devolution if you don't fund it properly? So that's really what they're complaining about.
Okay.
And then finally, on economy, we have this from the Bank of England, and they are alleging that they've discovered a new economic bubble, which is the buy-to-let market. And apparently, George Osborne said last week that he intended to prick the bubble this week, and this seems to be the start of it. And how are they doing that? Well, basically, they are going to make it harder for landlords to get buy-to-let mortgages. So what they're admitting is that there's a mortgage market has appeared where mortgages are being sold to inappropriate buy-to-let landlords, people that can't really afford it. So they're going to put stricter affordability tests in and try to cool that market off a little bit. So where's that going to leave people that need rental accommodation?
Well, we're going to mention Melanie Shaw in a minute, actually, to do with cost of accommodation. It's going to lead them into troubled areas, Mike. Ian Crane.
Just a reminder that because we were on holiday yesterday, Ian Crane's programmes are on tonight. So 1930 for Humanity versus Insanity. That's going to be Dr. Graham Downing. Fracking Nightmare. I'm not certain who's going to be on with Ian for that, but do join us for those programmes if you get the chance.
Excellent. Well, here we are on the subject of accommodation. This is Nottingham City Homes demanding money from Melanie Shaw. So Melanie just about getting her life back together after being put in prison, hounded, bullied and assaulted by the police in Nottingham. So now we come up with a quick letter demanding a mere £1,048 and you've got 14 days to pay. Just remind people, of course, that it was Melanie's testimony and Mickey Summers and others. There's been a lot of people who've been pointing out the abuse going on in the system. So this man, Loggins, sentenced for 20 years. So the testimony is right. The abuse went on. This is the leader of the council. We're going to mention him in a minute. But basically, he's apologised for all the abuse. It's all in the past, Mike. None of it going on today. None of it going on recently. It's all in the past. He's apologised. But what happens if you are one of the abuse survivors?
You continue to be victimised.
Yeah, you'll just continue to be kicked in the teeth. That's the better description. Well, we spoke to Nottingham City Homes this morning, and we said, is it fair for you to send these sorts of threatening letters to vulnerable people? And they said, well, we've got to collect the money, and yeah, some people will find it a bit difficult. But they then admitted that actually, if you've got financial problems, maybe you only have to pay back £3 a week. It's to do with money and profit, although they didn't like to talk about the word profit. Well, here we are. Here's the leader, Alan Rhodes, and I'm sorry the text on screen is a little bit hazy. That was the best I could get. But online you can find a copy of his apology to the child abuse victims and survivors. But he says we got it wrong. It was all in the past. We're going to do better in the future, but presumably if we don't do better in the future, we're going to apologise and carry on as normal. And we just remind people, of course, that this is the same Nottingham Council leader that's now attacking beggars and homeless people, and that's producing quite an astonishing backlash. Appalling policy towards the vulnerable in your city. These are despicable people, Mike. I mean, this man is tweeting out at the moment that everything is the fault of the Tories. He's Labour, so it's all the fault of the Tories. And they're paying out pitiful sums of compensation to child abuse survivors, £10,000 for abuse over many years, and then your subsequent life ruined. No income, no proper home, living on the streets or in worse circumstances, and you're going to be paid £10,000 and then go away. Yeah, welcome to Britain. And this brings us probably nicely onto the NHS, so another one of Britain's treasured institutions, which is virtually privatised now. There's no doubt about this. But they've got a meeting coming up. This is Tuesday, the 28th of June, Manchester Conference Centre. And what will be discussed, it's transforming to the future workforce configuration to deliver the 5-year forward view. Do you understand that, Mike?
No.
Well, this is over the rainbow stuff. This is to do with the fact that the NHS is not about treating the sick and assisting the vulnerable. It's to do with future leadership. This is common purpose at work. And all we can say is the common purpose leadership has increased in the NHS, the newspeak has increased, and the bodies pile up, because that is what is actually happening. So there we are. If you're unsure about the NHS, don't worry, because it's transforming to the future workforce configuration to deliver the 5-year forward view. Okay, well, have a look at this, because the Mail is hyping up dementia. A classic article here, which is scaremongering. So they've got an expert to assess 5 brave volunteers who he's assessing as to whether they're going to get dementia. Of course, nobody knows the cause of dementia at the moment, so this is a scare story. And we've got expert opinion, as I say, when the causes of dementia are not known. So who's going to benefit? Well, it's going to be more profit for the big pharma drug companies. And if you want the evidence of that, we found it here in the Bexhill-on-Sea Observer. Sussex dementia experts welcome Alzheimer's drug. This is the gentleman featured in the Daily Mail article we've just covered, Dr. Naji Tabet, who's an old age psychiatrist in the Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. And he's getting very excited because Eli Lilly's produced a new drug which they're going to use on dementia sufferers. Does it work or it doesn't work? They've got around the fact that nobody knows what causes the disease, so the drug isn't going to do anything to do with the causes, but they're causing it, and they're now saying the drug is disease modifying.
Does that make it worse then?
I think it's a transformational disease
Right.
drug, Mike. And what it will do is make more profit for Big Pharma. And let's not forget that David Cameron is so confident that he can ramp up dementia in this country that he set a target of some 2 million by 2050. This is a stepping stone. And of course, doctors are now being paid to diagnose dementia. And of course, they're being paid to prescribe those disease-modifying drugs. If you're worried about it, have a look at work done by Dr. Betty Martini and Corinne Gouget, who we featured last week. 2 very brave ladies who are pointing out damage to your brain as a result of everything from sweeteners to other additives and indeed some drugs.
Yes, well, the Times here reporting rip-off prices stop cancer patients getting new drugs. They're saying patients will be denied cutting-edge medicines because drugs companies are overcharging the NHS. Instead of the head of the treatments watchdog has said that's nice, of course, nice, responsible for deciding which drugs people have access to. But of course, it's not just big pharma at work here, because there's also little pharma at work, and you do wonder. Well, I'm quite sure that big pharma is behind this ultimately, but this is the use of hedge funds in order to inflate the price of so-called generic drugs as well. So unfortunately, it hasn't gone very well for them, and despite the fact that they've tried to add several zeros onto the price of generic drugs, they haven't made any money. So this is Valent and also another organisation called Pershing Square, 2 hedge funds. There's now a Senate inquiry into this, these 2 companies, certainly Valent, looking like it's going to default on $30 billion of debt, and Pershing Square not doing too well either. So perhaps this little strategy, because we know that Big Pharma has been complaining about the cost of the sort of low cost of generic drugs for a very long time, particularly in third world countries. This little strategy to ramp those prices up hasn't worked, it seems.
Well, if that hasn't worked, the deaths is working. We just remind you, of course, that David Cameron's government absolutely gloating that more people dying during the winter has brought in more money to the Treasury. So death is good for David Cameron's Tory government. At least he shares it around, Mike. It doesn't matter whether you're an overseas national. He's going to get you in unlawful wars, wherever it is, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, and sharing it around a bit in UK. Of course, I'm not joking. We are talking fact here. David Cameron's Tory government boasting about the amount of money it can bring into the Treasury through particularly elderly people dying. What is emerging in UK? Well, we couldn't put it any better than this video, which we'd encourage you to go and have a look at. It's called Confronting Plastic Authority. And what is the story about? It's about this young gentleman dropping a cigarette butt, whereupon the black-suited private security people say you're going to have to pay an £80 fine. The thing is that this was all captured on video, has been analysed from the point of view of what is law. And if you get to the simple facts of it, we've got a private company using its agents to break the law, but they then stand there and brief the local police on what the law is. And it's quite a remarkable video clip because the male and the female officer here clearly are going to back up the private company, even though none of them know what the law is.
This is a national disgrace that we have police constables on the street who have no idea what the law is.
Well, I believe it's deliberate. It's much the same as doctors not doing any proper training on the body as they go through. It's simply prescribe this drug, look on the computer. We've now got police officers coming through training. They're deliberately making sure they're not taught the law. Of course, what's going to happen is that those very same police men and women are going to be caught in the trap themselves when the private bailiffs turn up at their homes. So this is a fantastic little video clip and encourage you to watch it. And it's the gentleman who reported so excellently at the start of the Bilderberg conference last year. If you haven't seen, in 2013, have a look at that clip. Well, that brings us to the end of today's news. I'll just say that tomorrow we'll have Guy Taylor coming on to tell us about Tom Crawford. Tom Crawford has basically gone back into his house in Nottingham, a house that was unlawfully taken by bailiffs. And Guy Taylor will bring us up to date with what Tom Crawford's attempting to do. But I was told earlier this morning that for some reason the Nottingham police didn't want to arrest Tom.
Can't imagine.
Just maybe they're getting a little bit wary of people who know the law better than they do. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.